This demo is going to be to demonstrate modeling a piece of furniture, a basic couch. Um, it's going to include start to finish, modeling using some basic Autocad commands. And what you're seeing here is basically I'm downloading, or I downloaded a drawing from a website. It's a popular big box furniture store, which happens to have a sketch with dimensions and a photograph of what the couch would look like. You could do this, with something that is store-bought, that you could find an image and some sketches with some dimensions that you could download and use, or you could take a picture of existing furniture you have that you would basically create a sketch or a survey of that same piece of furniture. So you would just sketch it and measure all the component parts of that piece of furniture. All of those dimensions you will need as you model, and it's best to have that done prior to when you start modeling. So as you start modeling things, you don't have to worry about going back and forth to the piece of furniture to measure it. You have at least 90% of the dimensions there for you as you're modeling it. And what I'm doing now is just resizing the photographs, just so they're in relation to each other and they're scaled somewhat appropriately. You don't want to insert a picture that's so small, that's smaller than the model that you're building, so that you're having to zoom in and out of it, or you don't want it too large because then your model is too small. So just scaling it to a reasonable size so that it's relative to the model that you're going to build. As with all modeling, or most modeling, I tend to start with drawing a plan of whatever it is that I'm going to model. So what I'm going to do now is basically draw the plan of this couch, and then I'll draw an elevation of this couch, because a 3D model, just as all 3D models are, it's a combination of length, width, and height, right? So with the plan, you have your length and your width, and with the elevation, you'll have your heights. And when you're doing your survey or measuring the piece of furniture, keep that in mind, that you're measuring the length, the width, as well as the height, because this is going to be a 3D model. And the more information you have with that, the easier it is the easier time you're gonna have to build the 3D model in AutoCAD. Again, it's a little bit inefficient if, as you're modeling, you're having to go back and forth and having to measure stuff. It's better just to have everything in front of you, or at least as much as possible. So I'm gonna take a couple of minutes here, and you'll watch me draw the plan. It's just gonna be a basic plan, as close to what the piece of furniture is going to be. The more detail you put in it, obviously the more detail you'll have in the model, because we're going to be using these plans not just as a picture to look at, but we'll be using the actual lines that we're drawing now to help us actually construct the 3D model in place. It's important to mention that this video is going to be in real time. It's not compressed in any way. It's not, there aren't a lot of editing going on in here. It's showing in real time the process. And you'll see that sometimes I'm erasing things, and sometimes I'm deleting things, sometimes I'm playing with parameters, and I think that's very important in terms of the process. It's not, oh, let me model this and I'm going to do it in 5 minutes, and I get it done the first time and it's always right the first time. That's not the case. I've never modeled this couch before, and I'm doing it in real time. Yes, granted, I'm familiar enough with the commands, but again, you know, when you watch this video, and if you watch it several times, you'll see that I'm not using that many commands, and they're all very basic commands as well. So once you get a handle of these basic commands, you'll see that the process is basically, you know, the same. And I repeatedly say that because I just want to emphasize that if you can model one thing, you can model something else. Some just might be a little bit more challenging than others, but you know, it's just a matter of trying something. If it doesn't work out, try it again. There's many a times that I've modeled something where I think I'm done, and then I look at it and I'm like, that does not look like what it's supposed to look like, and I start over. But each time you do it, it it looks better and you become much more quick. Um, I think in total this video probably is about 45 minutes, which might sound like a long time to watch a video, but at the same time, you'll see the process as it happens in real time. Okay, and again, 45 minutes make a couch, it's done. I don't have to make this couch ever again, right? So, when I make any models that I make, I create basically a library of stuff that I save. So if I have another project I'm working on that I want to use a similar couch, I will, just insert it as a block, right? So, or I could just take it and modify. I don't necessarily need to start from scratch. So that's again, something to keep in mind. So as you can see, I started drawing the elevations of this couch. The plan is more or less done, uh, but now the elevation is going to have the vertical heights or the z-axis dimensions for the model. And once I have the plan and the elevation complete, I'll start to use these lines that I'm drawing to create the 3D model. And when I'm done with that, you'll see what I'm talking about. So as I said earlier, what I'm doing now is adding a little bit more detail to the elevations in the plan. The couch, if you look at it, has cushions. In this case, three separate cushions, which define three separate sort of sitting areas. The cushions are rounded, so I'm adding radiuses to the corners. Um, if I do that now, it'll again help me when I'm modeling, because I'll be able to use these curves as well. I could just model it as square kind of cushions, but you'll find that once you start modeling it that way, everything starts to look very blocky. Um, these curves, as slight as they are, will add a little bit of softness or realism to the model. And again, everything, even though some things may appear to be sort of like a sharp or square edge, oftentimes are somewhat rounded or softened or radiused. So that level of detail will help the model again look a little bit more realistic and less blocky. Even the edge of a countertop, usually it's not sort of this razor edge. It has a little bit of a round over it, whether it's a quarter of an inch or half an inch or something. It's usually rounded over. Wood furniture oftentimes is rounded. Yes, some instances it is a true right angle. In that case, that's what it is. But that detail will make things a lot more sort of realistic. the plan, if you've been watching, I went back into the plan and again added more detail to it. Um, and that's how it is. Like, in the beginning it was just sort of blocky. I went to the elevation and I went back to the plan, and it's sort of this iterative process of going back and forth. And what you just saw also was that I went to the upper right corner, and I went to the view cube and I changed the view so that it's more of a axonometric view, because at this point I'm going to start the modeling process. And what you saw was I copied the plan that I originally drew, so that I basically have two copies of that. My process typically is, I tend to make a copy of what my original drawing is in case I need to go back, modify it, or I mess up and I need to go back and make some changes. I always have the original. I find it very helpful, even though I might have two copies of the same thing. Once the couch is done, I might get rid of it, but as I'm working, the process has always helped me and saved me a number of times to be able to have a copy of what the original was. So here, what you're watching is I'm actually tracing the shapes or forms that make up this couch using the P line, and so the P line command. So basically, I'm using the P line to trace around sort of the parts and pieces of what this 3D object wants to be, and those are the P lines I'm going to use to basically extrude to create the 3D solid. And so, in this process, it's important to look at what it is that you're modeling and really break it apart and deconstruct it to see what the parts are that make up this object, right? So you're almost the opposite of putting it together, right? When you get a piece of furniture, and it's a type that you have to build yourself, it's all these parts and pieces that you follow instructions, and you're screwing one piece to this piece and putting on this bracket and putting on this panel, and it's piece by piece. This is almost the opposite of that, right? So you have a completed piece of furniture or an object, and you're deconstructing it into its parts, its sort of basic geometric shape, and those are the shapes that you're going to end up modeling. And as you model each parts and piece, the object itself will start to come to life, and we'll see that here as I start to trace around again each one of the objects that that seems to be making up this couch. So that's the armrest, that's the back. You'll see me trace around the cushions. Here I'm tracing the legs. So all of these things I'm tracing with a P line. Now something I want to mention now, since as we start getting to the point where we're actually going to model stuff and that we're layering sort of this information on, is that it's important to create layers. Just like when you're doing two-dimensional drawings, it's important to create layers for 3D work. Probably just as important, if not more important. And what I tend to do is I'll create layers with a prefix of 3D, so that in the layer manager, they all fall within a group. So 3D dash. If it's a couch, I'll say couch. And if it's a subcomponent of that couch, I'll say 3D dash couch dash leg, 3D dash couch dash cushion, 3D dash couch dash arm, or something like that, just so I could differentiate between all the parts and pieces. As you start modeling things, especially things that are a little bit more complicated, it gets a little bit harder to handle and a little bit harder to see objects because they're overlapping each other, and you're sort of seeing through objects, right? And selecting objects can be difficult as well sometimes. So creating different layers for the different 3D components of that single object is very helpful, because you could turn them on, you could turn them off, you could lock them, you could do all sorts of things to be able to control how you're working, and that becomes really important. When you start talking about rendering, that also becomes very important, because there's different ways of rendering and assigning materials and things like that, but one way is to assign materials based on layers, so everything that's on the same layer will get the same material. But again, that's another conversation for another day. But That's basically, again, the general process. That image on the right side is a dining room table that there's another video on how to um, model that. So you might want to take a look at that as well. Um, so you're just going to continue watching the process of basically tracing or creating P lines around the shapes and forms. Sometimes I might actually take the actual lines that were already drawn and make them into P lines, or I might trace it and create a whole new P line, depending on what process works at the moment. Um, Sometimes I have difficulty, tracing a P line because the arc's not right, so I might draw the P line. It might look a little bit off, and then I'll go in and modify it. Sometimes it's just easier just to use the polyline edit command and just turn all those separate line segments into a polyline. Or you could use the join command, Join, to join all those line segments together. That's one other thing that's also important, is that when you're 3D modeling, especially modeling solids in Autocad, it's super important that the polylines that you're using to model are in fact closed, so that they basically come around and they end where they start. That way, when you extrude it, they are true AutoCAD solids. If they're open, if for some reason the end does not, you know, come back around to where the start point is, if there's a gap in the line, in the polyline, when you extrude it, you'll get something more like a mesh. And a mesh is basically, building an object out of thin pieces of paper. But when you extrude open polyline, it becomes a mesh, and it doesn't create a top, it doesn't create a bottom, and it's just basically a thin surface that has some limitations in terms of its ability to manipulate. But solids are much easier in this instance to be able to handle. But in order for a solid to be created, it has to be a closed polyline. So again, that's a very important tip to make sure you understand. If you model something and it doesn't look like a solid, there's like sort of like a netting placed over the top of it. You see a grid over the top of it, like on all the surfaces. That's a sure sign that your polyline was open and you just extruded a mesh as opposed to a solid. So again, a solid will look like a solid. It won't have any surface on it. There's no grid on it. You'll see as I start modeling it what that looks like. So now I'm starting the extrusion process, and what you just saw there was basically taking the polyline that defines the sort of armrest and backrest of this couch, and I used the extrude command to extrude that to the height of what that armrest is. So I'm referring back to now my survey where I took those dimensions. In this case, it was a sketch provided by the manufacturer. Um, and I'm extruding those objects to the size or the height of what it needs to be. And there's two P lines at this point, right? One that defines the back and the sides, and one defines the base of the couch, right? So that's what I just did there. I extruded the base now, and now it's starting to come together. It's the base, the back, and the armrest. So um, now I'm, modeling, or I'm drawing in the plan the location and size of the little feet. So I'm not sure what the shape is of the actual couch, but I assumed it was round. Um, and if it was a square or rectangle, whatever, it's the same thing, right? So I'll take that circle, I'll extrude it. I could extrude it as a straight extrusion where it looks basically like a cylinder, and there's also an option when you're extruding to extrude it with a taper if the leg has a taper where it gets wider at the top than it is at the bottom, or vice versa. And here I'm just moving that cylinder into position. And when you're moving things in 3D, it's also important that you use reference points, right? You're picking the object, you're moving it. The base point ideally should be a place that exists on both the two-dimensional drawing, if you're modeling it this way, and the three-dimensional um, model, so that you can reference it and move things relative to that base point. So here I moved it based on the outer midpoint of that front face of the armrest, and then I know in one direction it's in the right place, and I just have to move it back underneath it in the right place as well. So if you know the dimensions of that, then obviously you could just move it in that direction. There's obviously 4, 5, 6 feet, so I will copy those feet into their various locations at the various corners of the couch. And if you notice, when I extruded the back and the base, not only did I extrude it, I also raised it up in the z-axis, right? So I picked it up off the floor, so to speak, about 4 inches, because the couch has sort of a clear space underneath. You saw me do that earlier as well, because when you're drawing in 2 dimensions, it's going to draw along that plane, which is the XY plane, right? So when you turn that in 3D, that XY plane is more or less the floor, right? So if you're extruding those polylines that you drew on that XY plane, you're basically extruding it from the floor. Yes, some furniture comes straight down to the floor that doesn't have feet. That's fine. In some cases, there are furniture that has feet in it, in which case you would have to raise that up. Now I'm on to modeling the cushions, and the cushions, the basic shapes of the cushions are basic rectangles, right? So I began by just modeling a rectangle that takes on the size of the rectangle, and there, uh, what you saw was using a command after I created this sort of clunky box. is a command called smooth or smoothing or smooth mesh. Um, and so what that does is basically take an object, like a box or like this couch, and it creates sort of this smooth mesh over the top of it. And basically rounds over all the corners. It makes it smooth. Um, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But what you saw there also is after I smoothed it, you could see it the overall size is correct to what I drew. But again, adding a little bit more detail, I probably will kind of make this a little bit bigger so that it overhangs the edge of the couch. Because if you look at the couch in detail, it does have a little bit of an overhang typically over the edges, right? It's small, but it's a little bit, right? You don't see that sort of flat surface of that base, right? The cushion covers that up, but when I put on this smooth edge, you see that there, it reveals some of that. Again, details, but the smooth command basically puts this grid on it and it creates these smooth edges. That smooth surface is controlled by the mesh properties, and the more grids you put on it, the sort of smoother it is, I should say. Or actually, if you look at it the other way, that probably makes more sense. The more grid you put on it, the denser that mesh is, the more the less blocky it looks, but the radiuses of all the smoothing becomes a little bit smaller. So, for instance, the couch, the cushions I just modeled had maybe 8